What's up, guys? It's Morgan Ross Alexander, and in today's video we're going to be discussing adjusting your perspective. And before I get into it, hope y'all like the hairstyle. I'm wearing my crown right now. No one else has anything like me, and that's what makes it so unique. That's a majority of the reason why I like it so much. But just a quick shout out to my haircut. And other than that, let's get right into this topic of readjusting your perspective. So when it comes to readjusting a perspective, this comes into play at all sorts of points and places and spaces of the lives that you live, the life that I live, the lives that we all live. And it comes into factor when, you have an existing perspective and something happens, an event occurs. You go through a scenario, you go through a situation, you go through an experience where out of that experience, what needs to be occurring in the outcome of that experience is a readjustment of your perspective. So readjusting your perspective is a big concept, and it's a process, an important process, and an important mechanism in what we deal with as beings in the day-to-day life, in the experience-to-experience life. Readjusting the perspective is something that you're bound to come across, and you're bound to be faced with having to do some readjusting of your perspective, and that's something that you cannot get around. That's something that you don't want to get around, because at the end of the day, when you readjust your perspective, boom, you're set on another path. You're set with another perspective. You're looking at things through a different lens. You now have ways to go about this in a better way of having a way to view it, aka the perspective, the way that you view a certain situation. And after readjusting your perspective, you can now move forward in a much more harmonious way. You can now move forward in a way where you're not necessarily thinking about the past or that said scenario, said situation or experience that occurred that could be a minor disappointment, could be a major disappointment, anything that could be a letdown. You got your hopes up too high, whatever that may be, and then you go through a situation and you're forced to have a new perspective, forced to readjust your perspective. So when it comes to readjusting your perspective, you're going to deal with this eventually, and that's why this is such an important concept, because when you do readjust your perspective, then you're on another path. Now you're setting yourself on another path. Now you're setting yourself with new goals. Now you're readjusting the way that you perceive what it is that you're going through once you start to readjust your perspective. So when it comes to readjusting your perspective, we're going to talk about it in regards to going through certain situations mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and what that means in regards to readjusting your perspective. So when it comes to mentally, mentally you may have your mind fixated, you may have your thoughts, your thought patterns, the way that you've been thinking about things leading up to this scenario, situation, or experience in such a fixated way that when you do go through this experience and this experience doesn't go necessarily the way that you thought it would, doesn't go necessarily the way that you premeditated it mentally expecting that situation to go. And after going through that situation, you have to be able to readjust your perspective. After dealing with that disappointment, after dealing with your hopes being crushed or your spirit being crushed, or whatever that may be in regards to what you had expected, what had you been mentally fixated on, and what have you been thinking about mentally in regards to this event, or mentally in regards to this goal, mentally in regards to this situation of how it was going to play out. And when you go through that disappointment, you go through that situation where it didn't play out the way that you thought it would, you go through it where the perspective that you had originally had wasn't what ended up playing out in reality. And that's as far as mentally. Well, how do you readjust your perspective now after going through that in regards to mentally? Mentally, immediately start to think of new ways or new possible outcomes as far as mentally. Mentally think on, okay, if it didn't go the way that I expected it to go, let me readjust my perspective as far as mentally. Therefore, down the road, I'll be able to have that mental strength and have that mental stability and that mental power to be able to be in that situation in making the right decisions as far as mentally. Therefore, I'm not making these decisions mentally out of disappointment. I'm not making these mental situations out of extreme severity of a situation, extreme pressure of a certain situation. No, I'm adjusting my perspective. Therefore, I have a new way of looking at the situation mentally. I see, okay, maybe that wasn't the right thing. I can see and I can think that mentally, maybe this happened in a way where mentally this is going to be something that builds me up as far as mentally. And this new perspective that I'm developing is enlightening me, or let's say mentally growing me and developing my mind to be able to take even more difficult news, even more difficult disappointment, even harder situations and experiences that you might have to go through. And now that you're developing this perspective and adapting your perspective to now your new situation and the situations that you've gone through and how you're going through those situations, now mentally you're that much more stronger. The perspective that you have as far as mentally is now geared toward your success down the road as far as dealing with things of this similarity or other things where now mentally your perspective is much more awakened. You're more consciously aware, having this newfound mental perspective when it comes to anything that you have to deal with. Mental discomfort, thinking, how will other people perceive? How will this be perceived externally? How I've already done a certain thing as far as mentally communicating or mentally thinking that I was already going to be successful with this, or this was already going to play out the way that it was going to play out. You had those expectations as far as mentally. So one could say, maybe draw back on your expectations to avoid having disappointment, avoid having your hopes crushed. Pull back some of that expectation. But going through a situation where you're in a situation where you have to develop a new perspective from going through a situation of this, you find out that that doesn't necessarily matter. The perspective that you're developing is that the only thing that is important is that I can see, mentally perceive, and think about and communicate about why the situation went the way it went. Why the situation is beneficial now through going through this the way that it went through. And in developing that perspective, you're able to see it in see the situation, thus said, in a different perspective. Therefore, you have more ways to think about it as far as mentally, more ways geared towards success to think about it as far as mentally, more ways to mentally use your mind to possibly make that situation go even better next time, possibly prepare even more for the next time you're in a situation of that nature by adapting and redeveloping your perspective, which is bound to happen through that process. You can be more mentally strong. You can be more mentally in your power as far as going through these situations and having to adapt and, adjust your perspective. And adjusting your perspective is just that. Sure, it might be difficult at times. You might go through some opposition. You might go through some mental fixation, mental wanting to stay complacent, but that's with anything that you're going to have to deal with as far as mentally. So you have to use that mental power that you have. You have to be in the right mental space and the mental state in order to adjust your perspective to what is going to best benefit you now going from this point on, after going through certain situations, experiences, and scenarios. And thus being said, mentally, you'll be more in a developed state. You'll be more mentally sound. You'll be more mentally knowledgeable. You should be more mentally wise when it comes to how you're going to act and how you're going to move forward from the situation in regards to mentally. And that's all it is. It takes you a process. It's a mechanism to readjust your perspective to what it now could be to most benefit you. If you go through a tough situation, you go through a situation where you're in difficult times or whatever that may be, okay, readjust your perspective mentally to where now you have a better way of thinking about the situation, where you're not so hard on yourself as far as mentally, you're not so mentally fixated on a certain outcome and having so many mental expectations of how this situation, scenario, or experience should go. Now with this readjusted perspective, you can move forward in a more harmonious way, in a path of least resistance as far as mentally, now with this newfound readjusted mental perspective. You can attack everyday life, everyday experiences all situations that you go through with this newfound mental perspective. And going forward with this mental perspective, the momentum that you carry from not allowing the situation, the scenario, the experience that you went through, that you had to find a new and readjust your perspective as far as mentally, now you take that importance and the momentum of having the newfound mental perspective, and that diminishes what happened over there. That diminishes what went wrong. That diminishes what didn't go the right way. That diminishes what's ever in the past, because you're overcoming that, and so you outweigh with the newfound mental perspective and the strength that you have and the power that you have as far as mentally to move forward from this situation. You now maintain your power over that situation, whatever that may be. You have to know and have the ability to check your perspective as far as mentally, and to be able to readjust your perspective as far as mentally. Whatever that means, you could be going through a difficult time trying to readjust your perspective. You could be adapting to a new situation, scenario, or experience that you're dealing with. You could be trying to adapt to that, to where you have to adjust your perspective. You could be going through anything that one can be going through, and power to you for going through that, and power to you to go through that situation and readjust your perspective in order to go through that situation in the ways that are best meant for your state of well-being, whether that be mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But it starts as far as mentally, to be able to readjust that perspective and structure it as far as mentally, to be able to think about how you're going to make this possible. Think about what things you're going to do mentally to make this possible. Think about what are you going to do to make this physically possible. Think about how you can make this possible, of the outcome that you're gearing your newfound perspective and readjusted perspective to. As far as emotionally, how can you go about it? How can you go about making this possible as far as spiritually, while thinking about that as far as mentally, thinking about the ways that you can spiritually have a newfound perspective and use that readjusted perspective for the greater success of whatever goal, plan of action that you have in mind. So this is for the go-getters. This is for those who are out there who are going through whatever they're going through, and knowing that, hey, you got to live a certain lifestyle. You got to readjust your perspective to be a certain way if you want to live a certain way. You got to do certain things and look at things certain ways when it comes to mentally if you want to enjoy certain things as far as mentally. You got to put in mental work in certain places if you want to have the fruits of your labor as far as mentally presented to you in a way where it's something that you can use in order to maintain that success, in order to maintain and continue on adjusting your perspective geared towards the most beneficial thing towards your state of well-being in all states of being. And going forward with this as far as mentally, you can readjust your perspective and maintain that strong mental perspective, maintain looking at things through a very strong mental lens. Therefore, you can readjust your perspective. When it comes to physically readjusting your perspective, okay, well, you've gone through a certain situation, you've done a certain action, or you've been in a certain situation, scenario, or you've gone through a certain experience where you got to readjust your perspective as far as physically. You got to readjust the way that you look at things as far as physically. You got to readjust the way that you look at people, places, and things in your physical reality. And by readjusting that perspective, you can gear that perspective towards the beneficial areas and ways that you can act as far as physically from this point on. And being able to readjust your perspective as far as physically can help you in the sectors of physical health, sectors of physical well-being, sector of physical status, sector of financial status, sector of financial independency, sector of financial growth, sector of financial development, sector of self-improvement as far as physically. These sectors can be improved much greater when you readjust the perspective that you have and start to move forward physically with that newfound physical perspective. So it's all in the way that you look at things. It's all in the way that you recognize, okay, I got to start looking at things in this perspective as far as physically. I got to start being in this state and in this space by having this physical perspective, by having the physical wisdom and the physical knowledge to be able to move about in the physical ways that we interact with the world in ways that are geared toward my readjusted perspective towards the greater success, towards greater development, towards greater growth as far as physically, towards building, towards expanding, towards expansion as far as physically, rather than things that are going to degrade me, rather than things that are going to have me running out of resources, rather than things that are going to take away. I'm going to invest, and I'm going to gear my perspective and look through a lens of things as far as physically that are geared towards growth, that are geared towards building up my states of well-being and building up my physical existence to a place where whatever happens, happens. Whatever thing I go through as far as physically, whatever people, places, or things that I have to deal with, we'll make it through. No matter how much hard, grueling, energy-taking, hard-working, being a freaking workhorse in this area, having to do this certain thing, grinding physically, putting in extremely hard work and consistent work, knowing and having that perspective that I can do this because I know what I've done as far as physically before, and I have the proof in the exact, and I'm seeing that proof through my physical perspective, and I'm now developing a physical perspective of, we're going to make this work, we're going to make this happen, we're going to build this as far as physically, we're going to get to where we want to go as far as physically, we're going to physically make these certain things happen, we're going to change and shape and build our physical state of reality and the physical state of being that we are in as far as individually, making it and creating it to be the best for what it is that we're trying to achieve, what goals we're trying to achieve physically, what missions we're trying to achieve physically, how much work, what kind of work we're trying to put in as far as physically, getting results as far as physically, getting the outcomes of certain situations and scenarios and experiences that we go through, and reaching those physical outcomes through those situations. So when it comes to readjusting your perspective as far as physically, being able to know that you're going to make work whatever it is that you have to make work, and you're going to build towards that. You're going to work towards that as far as physically. You're not going to let the situation or the external situation to outweigh the influence that you have on the situation. You keep that power as far as physically. You are the one that has that power as far as physically to develop a perspective, readjust a perspective to move from any point forward, from a difficult point forward, from a not so difficult point forward, from a point forward where you had to really work for something physically, from a point forward where something was came to your existence as far as physically, from a point of moving from that point on and having that perspective that you have to put in more work, and when you might have a perspective of certain things I haven't done for a while. There's certain things that I haven't been involved with as far as physically. And now realizing that, okay, I can physically have a perspective and readjust my perspective as far as physically of, now I can do this right now because I have put in the work as far as physically. Now I can do this now because this is going to benefit the readjusted perspective that I now have in terms of physically to, be a beneficial part of moving forward as far as physically, being a beneficial part of building more and more as far as physically. This action that I haven't done for a while, I can return to this action in a state of strength. I can return to this action in a state of having the physical perspective of power, having the physical perspective that I control my reality as far as physically, having the physical perspective that I am who I am, and I am going to do what I am going to do. I'm going to do what it is that I think I need to do, and do that and put in the work as far as physically. I'm going to do and what I see that I need to do as far as looking through my physical perspective of what I need to do as far as physically. I'm going to do what I need to do as far as feeling emotionally about what path that I am on and what work that I need to do as far as and how I'll feel about that work, and gearing that emotional intuition towards dialing in what exact work I need to put in as far as, and looking through the perspective of what I need to do as far as physically. Readjusting my perspective of, I'm going to make whatever happens as far as physically occur, and I'm going to use my spiritual power, I'm going to use my spiritual strengths and my spiritual abilities to assist me in looking through that perspective of what it is that I need to work on as far as physically. What are the things that I need to start doing and dialing in as far as physically? How do I need to move now to make this happen? How do I need to start to act as far as physically to make this happen? What do I need to do in order to make this a reality? And making that a reality is a goal for you to work for. It's a mission to put you on, and now you have that physical perspective of, this is where I am now. I can see where I am as far as physically. I have that perspective. I'm looking through things with a clear perspective as far as physically, and envisioning and imagining where you're going to be as far as physically down the line. X down the line. Whatever that may be, whatever period of experience that may be, thinking and imagining, okay, this is where I'm going to be. Developing that perspective of, this is what we're going to do physically. This is what we're going to experience as far as physically. This is the work that we're going to put in. Therefore, we're in this next situation as far as physically. Even though when we went through a tough, difficult, opposing situation that we just went through, we made it out of that situation, and we're going to make it out of this situation. Even though we went through something difficult as far as physically, we're redeveloping and readjusting our perspective to move on as far as physically to where we're in a better place than we were before, whatever it is that you went through as far as physically. So when it comes to readjusting your perspective as far as emotionally, you could have been feeling a certain way about how you wanted things to go. I feel like this has to happen. I feel like if this doesn't happen, then that's not the right thing. I feel like everything that's led up to this point has made me feel this certain way about how this should go, how the outcome of this situation, scenario, or experience should be. I feel like if it doesn't go my way, I'm so attached to the outcomes and I'm so emotionally fixated to these things to where I can't see anything else. I can't have another perspective. My perspective is so fixated that emotionally I'm now stuck and I'm now docile in that energy as far as emotionally, and seeing that thing, that perspective as far as emotionally, where I can't move forward now. I'm emotionally stuck on that. I'm emotionally not able to be vulnerable emotionally to now experience new things. No. None of that is the way that you want the situation that you're going through. In order to develop a new perspective as far as emotionally, that is actually the opposite of ways that you should be seeing and that you should be having a perspective of you going through, of the ones that you're involved with going through as far as you and your guys' plan for success. You know, when it comes to emotionally, who gives a damn that you felt that way about that before? Who cares that it didn't go the way that you wanted it to go? Who cares that you can't move on as far as emotionally, because you really can. You just feel that way, but not realizing that if you take back your power as far as emotionally and you readjust your perspective, you can have an emotional strength. You can have emotional abundance in the opposite way of what you were geared towards before, when you couldn't see anything else through that perspective as far as emotionally. Now, with readjusting your perspective as far as emotionally, you're strong enough to say, I got the power. I'm fulfilling myself as far as emotionally, as giving myself the go-ahead to readjust my perspective as far as emotionally, to not give certain care to certain things that I gave in the past, to where that didn't end me up in the right situation, to now move and interact and have emotional reactions and interact emotionally with the world in certain ways now that are geared towards the success down the road, that are geared towards creating the reality that you want to create. Therefore, you will experience these things as far as emotionally. You will be in this experience and this reaction to the reality that you are in and the emotional existence and the state of being that you're in as far as emotionally, through this newfound emotional perspective of, I make this my reality. I emotionally validate my emotions. The way that I am interacting in the lens that I see the world through as far as emotionally, I create this. I'm the one that has the power in order to make this thing work. I'm the one, and I feel like I'm the one to make this work. I'm the one, and I feel like nothing else matters, and I'm going to make this work. Having the perspective and readjusting to the perspective of, it doesn't matter how I feel. If I know that I'm moving towards success, I can feel good about that. It doesn't matter how I feel in the meantime of how difficult the situation is. If I have the perspective that I'm moving forward to a space of success, in a space and state of reaching my goals, and therefore emotionally that is where I want to be as far as emotionally, I can move forward from this situation to the next situation in the best way, in the way of least resistance as far as emotionally, in the way of having the most pass by of dealing with any difficult emotional states and emotional spaces, emotional energies, whatever that may be, whatever that may be, as far as what one will go through as far as emotionally, as what one will deal with as far as emotionally. But having that perspective emotionally, that doesn't matter what it is I go through in the short term, how I feel as far as emotionally in the short term, of course I can be aware and use my emotional intuition to learn certain things and to see and have the perspective of, how things are going and whatever that may be. But I'm never going to let that emotional state of being, and I'm going to have the perspective of never letting that emotional state of being ever keep me behind from readjusting my perspective. I'm never going to have that perspective of looking at something emotionally in a fixated way where I can't have any other outcome come and have that and not have that affect my emotional state of being. You want to have that not affect your emotional state of being, and having that perspective of it is what it is. I'm going to go through what I'm going to go through, and emotionally I'm going to ease the struggle as much as I can as far as emotionally by having the perspective of being emotionally intuitive, being emotionally independent, being emotionally strong, being emotionally validative of your own emotional state of being, and not looking towards external places, people, and things for emotional fulfillment or emotional validation. So developing that perspective is going to help you be able to move forward as far as seeing things in emotional perspective of this is how it's going to feel. I might feel this, I might feel that, but at the end of it, in having this new perspective, I can feel this way. I can have this new perspective of this is how I feel. I can have this new perspective of this is how I react to things. I can have the new perspective of this is how things are going as far as emotionally. Therefore, you're moving forward with a new perspective as far as emotionally. And we're going to get right into spiritually as far as adjusting your perspective spiritually. Adjusting your perspective spiritually could be learning new and developing your own spiritual systems, doing spiritual research, doing spiritual, diving deep into spirit work, or a shadow work, one may say, or some say. And that's simply going through experiences and finding out things that are not necessarily surface level, thus shadow, some things that are in the dark or being in a shadow, doing and delving into certain things as far as spiritually. Therefore, you can readjust your spiritual perspective. I see. Now I understand and have the spiritual perspective of this mechanism, of this story that I read, of this process and the way that things had played out, and now I can see the spiritual aspects to it. Now I can have the spiritual perspective of how I can apply that to my reality, not just spiritually, but emotionally, physically, and mentally. And therefore, you're using your spiritual state of being to look through your experiences that you're going through and the reality that you're in through a spiritual perspective that is higher up, through a spiritual perspective that is much wiser, through a spiritual perspective that is much more knowledgeable, through a spiritual perspective that is much more insightful as far as what you are going through, and compared to what has been written down and what has been experienced throughout time. You're developing a spiritual system. You're developing the ways of you under and understanding the certain things that you learn as far as spiritually. As far as spiritually, readjusting your perspective, the more things that you go through to where you have to redevelop your perspective and adjust your perspective as far as spiritually, you're spiritually growing just by going through the experiences that you go through. Therefore, spiritually, you know how to look at things as far as spiritually. Therefore, you know how to pick out certain things from the mental realm, from the physical, from the emotional realm, and know, okay, spiritually, I'm looking at it through this spiritual perspective, and I have had this readjusted spiritual perspective of this is the truth. Being able to cut through the lies, being able to cut through the veil and take down whatever it is that is unseen, and break through and to be able to see that which is unseen. And by having that spiritual perspective and adjusting your spiritual perspective through what it is that you're going through, you're spiritually growing. By becoming more mentally mature, you're spiritually becoming more mature. By becoming more physically mature, you're spiritually becoming more mature. By becoming more emotionally mature, you're spiritually becoming more mature. Thus, your perspective is being readjusted. Thus, you know how to look at things that you are going through, how to look at things that you're going through as far as mentally, and not end up beating yourself up on your path as far as spiritually, and having that perspective to go through things and look at things that you're going through as far as physically, and not be hard on yourself or beat yourself up as far as the way that you look at this and the spiritual lens and perspective that you have as far as spiritually. The way that you can now look at things and perceive what it is that you're dealing with as far as emotionally, and not be difficult and hard on yourself and beat up on yourself as far as spiritually, and now seeing things that you go through as far as spiritually in a higher perspective. Readjusting that perspective as far as spiritually, now that everything it is that you're going through spiritually, you are growing spiritually through that. You're developing spiritually through that. You're becoming more wise, more knowledgeable, more insightful as far as spiritually, to where you're gaining this perspective. And that's readjusting your perspective as far as mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually.